The smell of decay was the first thing he noticed. It clung to the air in that dim, narrow room, a sharp, almost metallic scent that seemed to twist through the silence like an accusation. The young man froze, his breath held tight in his throat, eyes darting toward the source, a flask, its neck curved like a swan, standing alone on the table. The liquid inside had clouded overnight. Something had gone wrong. He stood still, listening. Outside, faintly, came the shuffle of footsteps, the janitor, perhaps, or something else, something that did not belong in a laboratory. He could not tell. For a long moment, he simply watched the small glass vessel as if it might whisper its secrets. There was a tension to the scene that even he could not explain. The air had grown too quiet, too thick with invisible things. Louis Pasteur had never liked silence. Silence meant the absence of explanation, the space in which superstition crept back. And yet, tonight, in the deserted École Normale laboratory, silence was all that remained. His assistants had left hours earlier, and the city beyond the walls had fallen asleep beneath a fog of coal smoke and winter mist. Only the steady ticking of the clock reminded him that time still moved. The rest of the world seemed suspended, waiting for something unseen to emerge from that cloudy solution. He approached the flask carefully, his fingers trembling, not from fear but from the uneasy anticipation that always came before discovery. His colleagues called him obsessive, sometimes fanatical, perhaps they were right. He could not rest until the mystery before him bent to reason. And yet, as he leaned closer, something else began to stir in his thoughts, an instinct older than science, older than reason. What if the others had been right? What if life did emerge from nothing, born of rot and shadow? He shook the thought away. Impossible. Nature followed rules, even if men had not yet found them. Still, the question burned in his mind: what force animated the unseen world? He reached for his notebook, scrawling notes by candlelight. The broth was sterilized, flask unbroken, exposure minimal, contamination improbable. His handwriting grew frantic, almost fevered, as he tried to capture every variable, every detail that might explain what he saw. And yet, the more he wrote, the more uncertain it all seemed. Somewhere beyond the laboratory walls, a carriage rattled by, and for an instant the flame flickered, throwing strange shadows against the wall. He paused. Something had shifted in the room. The hairs along his arm lifted. The light had changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, and yet the atmosphere felt altered, as if an invisible presence had entered with the draft. The flask trembled, or perhaps it was only the tremor in his hand. Either way, he could not shake the sense that he was not alone. Louis forced himself to breathe. "You are a man of science," he told himself. "You do not fear shadows." But fear was not the right word, it was wonder, sharpened by the awareness that ignorance itself was dangerous. What if the air carried more than dust and vapor? What if within it lived the agents of decay, invisible and merciless, turning food to rot, flesh to fever, life to death? He turned toward his microscope. The only light now came from the candle, glinting on the brass tube. His fingers tightened on the lens. It was through this glass, he believed, that the world would finally yield its secrets. Slowly, he lifted a sample slide, his heartbeat quick and uneven. The moment the lens focused, the silence shattered. A world of motion burst into view, tiny, darting shapes, dancing in the liquid, alive where none should live. He recoiled, startled, but fascination gripped him. These were no ghosts. They were real, structured, moving with purpose. Creatures of the unseen. For a long time, he simply stared, lost in a kind of awe that bordered on dread. Everything he had been taught, every lecture, every text, had told him that decay was chemical, spontaneous. But here, under the glass, was life. His pulse quickened. If life did not arise from nothing, if something, someone, carried it, then the implications were vast, terrifying. Disease, putrefaction, corruption, they all had agents. Not curses, not vapors, but living, multiplying invaders. And if that were true, then humanity lived in a war it could not see. He leaned closer to the microscope, watching the movement of one tiny organism, its shape trembling against the edge of focus. His hand tightened unconsciously around the edge of the table. Every instinct told him that this discovery was dangerous, that men would mock it, that it might undo more than it revealed. And yet, he could not stop. Curiosity was its own fever. Behind him, the door creaked. A draft slipped through, extinguishing the candle. Darkness swallowed the room. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, unable to see, unable to breathe. Then, from somewhere near the table, a faint sound, like the soft crack of glass. He turned sharply, his chair scraping against the floor, eyes straining to catch a glint of movement. Nothing. Only the faint, acrid smell of alcohol and burned wick. He struck a match. The brief flare of light revealed the flask, shattered. The liquid, cloudy and alive, now spilling across the table's edge. He caught the nearest rag, trying to contain it, but it soaked through his hands. The touch was cold, oddly slick, as if the substance resisted his grasp. He stared down at his trembling fingers, the faint glisten of the liquid catching the flame's glow. Somewhere deep inside, a thought whispered, "It's everywhere. The air, the water, the touch of every hand. Invisible life, moving unseen through the world." Outside, the clock tower told midnight. The sound rolled across the rooftops, distant and hollow, like a warning. Pasteur stood motionless, the match burning to his skin before he dropped it. The last flicker of light vanished, leaving only the dark and the echo of the idea forming in his mind, an idea that would change the world, though at this moment it felt less like revelation than prophecy. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat before the cold remains of the experiment, his mind whirling with questions he could not yet answer. Something vast, dangerous, and invisible had revealed itself, and he was its witness. Yet he could not tell whether he had discovered it, or whether it had found him first. A scream tore through the night, echoing down the empty cobblestone streets, sharp and urgent, though he could not tell from where it had come. Louis Pasteur froze, his hand gripping the railing of the laboratory stairs, ears straining for another sound. Silence returned almost immediately, but it was the kind of silence that pressed in, heavy and expectant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Something was moving, unseen, in the darkness beyond the laboratory walls. He forced his feet to move, descending the stairs slowly, each step careful, measured, almost ritualistic. His mind raced, not with fear alone, but with the exhilaration of knowing that the unknown had just announced itself. Last night, the flasks had revealed invisible life. Tonight, the city seemed to hum with the same restless energy, as if the world beyond his lab had begun to pulse with its hidden inhabitants. Pasteur knew that curiosity had a price. And tonight, he felt he was close to paying it. Reaching the street, he paused. The fog was thick, curling around gas lamps and the edges of buildings, hiding every alleyway in shadows. A single carriage rattled past, wheels clanging against cobblestones, but no driver was in sight. The sound vanished, swallowed by the mist, leaving only the faint whisper of movement somewhere just out of reach. He shivered, though not from cold. The sensation was deeper, a primal awareness that life existed in forms and numbers he had never imagined. Back in his laboratory, he pored over yesterday's notes, hands trembling as he recopied observations of the microbial shapes he had seen. Each detail was etched into his memory, but he could not rest with the questions pressing him from every angle. Were these creatures merely passive, or did they seek? Did they act in ways that would affect him beyond the safety of glass and flame? The answer seemed just out of reach, lurking in the shadows of knowledge yet to be discovered. A sudden crash startled him, glass shattering in the adjoining room. He spun, heart hammering, and found a small bottle of culture overturned, its contents seeping into the cracks of the floorboards. Nothing had touched it, nothing human, but the liquid moved with a faint, rippling motion, as though aware of his presence. Pasteur leaned closer, fascinated and unnerved, seeing the microorganism swirl with an almost deliberate coordination. The thought made his skin crawl. What if the smallest lifeforms were not passive? What if they were capable of action beyond observation? Hours passed unnoticed. Candle after candle burned down to the stub, each one casting grotesque shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to twitch in concert with the writhing life in the dishes. He began experimenting, changing temperatures, altering the broth, testing reactions, but each step led only to more questions. A tiny creature would react instantly, moving as if it sensed him, evading, dodging, adapting. Pasteur's notebook filled with sketches and frantic notes. Logic told him this was impossible. Yet the evidence stared back at him from the microscope, undeniable and unsettling. In the quietest hours before dawn, he heard it again, a faint scratching, almost beneath the floorboards, then over the ceiling, as though something small yet purposeful had taken to exploring his domain. Pasteur's pulse quickened. He had faced skepticism, doubt, ridicule from peers, but the sensation now was something different. This was not judgment, it was recognition. The world he had glimpsed in the glass was awake, alive, and aware of him. He poured a new solution into a flask, watching as the liquid shimmered. He adjusted the angle of light, his breath held, his mind racing with the implications. If these microorganisms could detect, evade, adapt, then they were not mere passive agents of decay, they were competitors, cohabitants of a world he had believed he understood. And if they were capable of this, then the next step, the step he dared not yet name, was frightening in its potential. Could they learn? Could they spread? Could they influence more than the broth in a glass? Footsteps sounded behind him. Pasteur whipped around, heart in his throat, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. Yet the air carried a weight, an unspoken presence, as if the very molecules had taken on intent. He moved back to his microscope, hands shaking. Every flick of the flame, every ripple in the liquid, seemed charged with significance, as if the room itself were alive, watching him, testing him. A sudden realization struck him: he could not separate observation from consequence. Every act he took in his laboratory, the mixing, the heating, the transfer of cultures, was a dialogue with unseen lifeforms. Each movement sent ripples through a hidden world he had never imagined, a world that now had the ability to respond. Pasteur felt the thrill and terror of discovery merge. Understanding came not just with insight but with responsibility, and the unseen consequences weighed upon him like a physical force. He paused, gripping the edge of the table, eyes wide at the undulating patterns in the broth. Then, a soft sound, like a whisper of cloth on stone, reminded him he was not alone in the building. He froze, every muscle tense, listening. The shadows seemed to shift, elongate, drawing closer. There was a rhythm to the room now, a pulse he had not felt before, synchronized with the movements beneath the glass. Something was awake. Something was aware. The first light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the shutters. Pasteur remained crouched over his instruments, heart racing, mind spinning. The night had revealed a world beyond human perception, one that had silently observed him as he observed it. And though he did not yet understand the full scope of what he had uncovered, one truth pressed relentlessly against the edges of his consciousness: knowledge came with peril, and curiosity could summon consequences far beyond imagination. He looked once more at the flasks, at the writhing life within, and knew that the events of this night had changed everything. The laboratory was no longer a sanctuary of controlled experiments. It was a battleground, a place where human reason confronted the unpredictable vitality of life itself. And somewhere in the shadows, beyond flame and glass, something was waiting, for him, for his next move, for the revelation that could shatter the comfortable illusions of the world he thought he knew. Pasteur did not turn away. He could not. The game had begun, and he was both observer and participant. Every movement in the broth, every flicker of shadow, every whisper of sound was a challenge. And in that challenge lay the seed of a truth that would demand courage, endurance, and ingenuity beyond anything he had yet imagined. The night had ended, but the confrontation with the unseen was only beginning. A scream tore through the laboratory, high and frantic, yet there was no one there to make it. Louis Pasteur froze mid-step, his hands clutching a glass pipette as though it were a talisman against the invisible threat. The shadows in the corners seemed to thicken, pulse, and shift on their own. Something moved just beyond the candlelight, something patient, calculating, and alive. He could feel it. He could not see it. He took a cautious step forward, then another, every muscle taut. His mind raced, each thought a double-edged blade, fascination battling dread. Yesterday, the tiny creatures had startled him with their movements, their unexpected vitality. Last night, the building itself had seemed complicit in the mystery, echoing sounds that belonged neither to man nor wind. And now, tonight, the air itself seemed charged, thick with anticipation, as though the unseen had grown bolder. Pasteur's eyes were drawn to a new flask on the table, the liquid inside rippling as if aware of his gaze. He reached out, then hesitated, knowing instinctively that this was no ordinary substance. His hand hovered above it, trembling. The memory of shattered glass, of microorganisms swirling with intent, lingered like a warning he could not ignore. Every instinct in his body screamed that he was close to a revelation, but closer still to danger. A scraping sound came from the floor beneath him, faint but deliberate. He spun, candle in hand, the flame wobbling as if caught in an invisible wind. The sound stopped. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then it returned, growing louder, a rhythm like tiny claws against stone. Pasteur swallowed hard, mind snapping between rational thought and the instinctive terror that had taken root in him. The laboratory, his sanctuary of reason, had become a cage, and something unseen prowled inside. He leaned over the microscope, hands shaking as he adjusted the focus. The creatures on the slide moved with a speed and coordination he had never imagined, dodging his attempts to isolate them, dividing and multiplying before his eyes. They seemed aware, reacting to his presence as if the observer were part of the experiment. He felt a thrill, yes, but also an inescapable weight of responsibility. Knowledge had its price, and the cost was beginning to manifest. A sudden crash made him jump. A bottle of nutrient broth toppled from the shelf, shattering against the stone floor. The liquid hissed as it met the cold surface, and the microorganisms within seemed to writhe violently, a miniature storm in a puddle of fluid. Pasteur's breath came fast. This was no longer observation, it was interaction, confrontation. Each movement, each ripple, each flicker of shadow carried significance he had yet to decipher. From the corner of his eye, he noticed movement, a dark, fluid motion, faster than his mind could follow. He turned sharply. Nothing. Only the shadows seemed to shift, elongate, coalesce. He reached for the flask, attempting to secure it, and the liquid responded, sloshing with a strange autonomy, almost as though it resisted his grasp. Pasteur's pulse raced. If these organisms were alive in the ways he feared, then containment was an illusion, safety a fragile pretense. He remembered the swan neck experiments, the moment he had proved spontaneous generation impossible. But now, in this room, the certainty of yesterday felt fragile, almost quaint. The creatures he studied were more than passive agents, they were adaptive, responsive, alive in ways that mocked the neat equations and hypotheses he had once relied upon. The knowledge that he had summoned something beyond ordinary comprehension pressed on him like a physical weight. A shadow flickered across the wall, not cast by candlelight, but by something else, something moving with intent. Pasteur froze, holding his breath, heart hammering. The laboratory seemed to contract around him, every table, every instrument, every vessel closing in as if alive. He realized with a jolt that the unseen world he had uncovered was not just present in the flasks, it was in the very air, the very walls, and perhaps even within him. He stepped back, colliding with a chair that tipped over with a crash, breaking the tension for a brief moment. But then the movement returned, closer, deliberate, impossible to ignore. He wanted to flee, to leave the building and escape into the safety of the streets, but curiosity rooted him in place. He had seen too much, learned too much, and the unseen presence seemed to know it. Pasteur returned to the microscope, hands trembling as he slid a new sample into view. The tiny forms within moved with even greater speed, an organized chaos that seemed almost intelligent. They reacted not just to his observation, but to his intent, his very attention. A realization struck him, he was no longer merely studying life. He was in a dialogue, a confrontation with an intelligence he could barely comprehend, one that defied the natural laws he had spent his life unraveling. The candle flickered and died. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and suffocating, yet the microorganisms remained visible under the faint light of the moon streaming through the shutter. He could see their movement clearly, a writhing, darting, purposeful dance. And in that darkness, Pasteur understood with a shiver that the true experiment had only just begun. The door creaked. A whisper of air, almost human in cadence, brushed past him. Pasteur's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Somewhere in the shadows, something waited. He could not see it, could not hear it fully, but the weight of its presence pressed against his mind. The creatures on the slide seemed to sense it too, their movement momentarily synchronized with an invisible rhythm. He swallowed hard, heart pounding, mind racing with the implications. Knowledge was no longer a tool for understanding, it was a challenge, a negotiation with forces that did not obey human rules. He had crossed a threshold, stepped into a domain where observation invited interaction, where every flick of his hand and every adjustment of his instruments reverberated beyond the limits of his comprehension. Pasteur stayed rooted at the microscope, watching, waiting, knowing that the night would not release him easily. Every pulse of life in the broth, every shadow along the walls, every whisper of movement in the air was part of a larger rhythm, a pattern he had yet to decipher. And somewhere beyond the candlelight, beyond the glass, the unseen waited, patient, intelligent, alive, marking him as a participant in a world far larger, and far more dangerous, than he had ever imagined. He could not turn away. To do so would be to abandon understanding. Yet staying meant he would confront dangers he could neither name nor measure. Pasteur inhaled deeply, bracing himself, and leaned closer to the microscope. The creatures in the slide shifted, paused, and then surged forward in a motion that mirrored the tension coiling within him. The night had grown older, but the confrontation had only begun. And in that moment, Louis Pasteur realized that discovery was not a gift, it was a challenge, one that demanded courage, ingenuity, and a willingness to face forces that lurked unseen, always watching, always aware. A scream echoed from the floor above, sharp and piercing, though Louis Pasteur knew with a jolt that no one had been there to make it. His heart pounded, and for a moment he feared the walls themselves had screamed. Something had changed. The shadows that had danced and pulsed around him in the previous nights now seemed to thicken, coalescing into forms he could almost, but not quite, recognize. He stepped forward, every nerve taut, hands trembling, knowing that the unseen was no longer passive. He could feel it watching him, waiting. The laboratory, which had once been a sanctuary of methodical experimentation, now felt like a battlefield where he had been unprepared for the enemy. The microorganisms he had once studied as curiosities had become agents of a hidden world, active, reactive, almost sentient. And tonight, something told him, they were not alone. Pasteur approached the microscope, hoping that focus and reason would shield him from the fear crawling up his spine. But as he peered into the lens, the tiny forms in the slides moved faster, almost aware of his presence, dodging and weaving in ways that no logic could explain. They were no longer just life in motion, they were strategy in motion. The realization struck him like a cold wind. He was no longer observing. He was participating in an interaction, a confrontation with an intelligence far beyond his expectations. He set down the slides and turned toward the flasks lined against the shelves. One of them shivered as if the liquid inside breathed. Pasteur's pulse quickened. The notion was absurd. Life did not move like that on its own. And yet, he had seen the evidence. Every stir, every ripple, seemed deliberate, as if some hidden will had orchestrated it. He dared not touch it, and yet he could not look away. A faint scratching sound began from the ceiling above him. It was subtle at first, almost ignorable, but then it grew, deliberate and methodical, moving from one corner of the room to another. Pasteur froze, listening. The hair on his arms bristled. He could no longer distinguish between the audible and the imagined. The line between reality and the unseen was dissolving. The air in the laboratory felt alive, vibrating with an awareness that pressed in from all sides. He grabbed a flask of sterilized broth, placing it carefully under the lamp. For hours, he manipulated the contents, testing temperature, observing reactions, jotting down notes in rapid, sometimes illegible scrawls. Every action seemed to provoke a response. The microorganisms within reacted almost preternaturally, shifting, dividing, moving with coordination he had never seen. Pasteur could not shake the sense that they were studying him as much as he was studying them. A sudden crash shattered the tension. A shelf tipped over, sending glass and liquid scattering across the floor. Pasteur jumped back, narrowly avoiding the spill. The sound seemed to echo unnaturally, reverberating as if the room itself was alive and responding to the disturbance. He caught sight of a shadow in the corner, fleeting and impossible to define, moving with a speed that defied logic. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the lingering sense of an observer he could not see. Pasteur leaned over the microscope again, his hands trembling as he adjusted the focus. The creatures on the slide seemed to surge in response to his gaze, coordinating in movements that were almost too precise for natural instinct. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Knowledge, he realized, was no longer a passive pursuit. It was a challenge, a test, a negotiation with forces he could barely comprehend. Footsteps echoed softly from the hallway outside, though he knew he was alone. The sound did not frighten him in the usual sense, it was heavier, charged with intent. Pasteur's mind raced. He had spent years learning to master observation, to control experiments, to dissect life into measurable components. Yet here, in this room, the rules he relied upon seemed suspended. The tiniest forms, unseen and immeasurable, dictated the rhythm, the response, the very flow of his night. He reached for a new slide, hand steadying as he prepared to introduce a sample of contaminated wine. The microorganisms reacted immediately, darting, clustering, forming patterns that suggested understanding. Pasteur's breath caught. Every flick of his hand, every adjustment of the flame, every movement in the room seemed to influence them, as though he had become a participant in a larger, invisible game. A soft whisper of movement passed behind him. He spun, eyes wide, but the room was empty. Only the flasks, the slides, and the trembling light of the candle remained. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, thick and inescapable, pressing against his mind. He understood with sudden clarity, he was no longer alone, even in this solitary pursuit. The life he had uncovered had agency, and it was aware of him, calculating, deliberate. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Pasteur's notes grew dense, filled with sketches of forms, observations of motion, theories of interaction. He felt himself pulled deeper, unable to rest, unable to escape the tension that now dominated his existence. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the invisible forces at play within a small laboratory. Inside, Pasteur confronted a reality that refused to yield to conventional thought, one that demanded ingenuity, courage, and vigilance beyond anything he had imagined. The candle flickered and went out, leaving the room in near total darkness. Yet he could still sense the motion in the flasks, the slides, the very air itself. The unseen world had grown bolder, more precise, its presence undeniable. Pasteur exhaled slowly, realizing that the night had changed him, changed the laboratory, and perhaps changed the very relationship between man and life. He straightened, gripping the edge of the table, and looked at the swirling forms in the glass. The tension in the room was unbearable, yet exhilarating. He could not leave, could not turn away, for every moment spent in observation drew him closer to a revelation that teetered on the edge of comprehension. Somewhere in the shadows, beyond flame and glass, the unseen waited. Patient. Intelligent. Alive. Louis Pasteur knew, in that suspended hour, that he was no longer simply a man studying life. He was a participant in a struggle with forces he could neither fully see nor fully understand. And as he leaned closer to the microscope, heart racing, he felt the weight of the invisible pressing against him, a challenge, a warning, and an invitation all at once. The confrontation with the unknown had begun in earnest, and he could not retreat. A scream split the night, wrenching through the laboratory as if the walls themselves were tearing apart, and Louis Pasteur knew instantly that something had crossed a boundary it should never have crossed. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, while every nerve in his body screamed that the unseen had grown bolder. He had been studying life, yes, but this was different. The room felt alive, charged with a presence that pressed against him, intelligent, patient, and invisible. Pasteur's eyes darted to the flasks, where the liquids he had carefully prepared seemed to quiver with anticipation. The microorganisms inside were no longer reacting solely to his instruments or light, they moved as if aware of him, responding to his very thoughts. His pulse raced. He had spent years proving that life did not spontaneously emerge, that the world could be measured and understood, yet now the rules he had relied upon trembled before forces he could neither see nor fully comprehend. He reached for his microscope, desperate for clarity, and peered into the lens. The creatures swirled with a coordination that was unnerving, almost purposeful. It was as if the microscope had become a portal, a point of contact with a realm of hidden intelligence. Every twitch of a microorganism, every pulse in the broth, communicated something he could feel but could not yet interpret. He realized then that he was no longer observing. He was communicating. And the thought sent a chill through him. A faint sound, like the scuff of tiny feet or claws, traveled across the floorboards, echoing softly yet insistently. Pasteur turned sharply, eyes wide, and saw nothing, only shadows that seemed too deep, too dark for the candlelight to penetrate. The tension in the room pressed in from every side, and he felt the fragile line between comprehension and chaos beginning to blur. He had touched a truth that had been waiting, patient for centuries, and now it demanded engagement. Hours passed with no relief. Pasteur experimented relentlessly, introducing variations of temperature, acidity, and exposure, noting how the microorganisms reacted with remarkable precision. Each observation revealed new layers of complexity, a hidden world of organization and adaptation. He understood with sudden clarity that these were not merely agents of decay, they were players in a system that obeyed laws he had only begun to uncover. Every movement he made rippled outward, each adjustment a dialogue with the unseen. Then, as if testing him further, a shadow flickered in the corner of the room. Pasteur froze, heart hammering, staring at the impossible. The air seemed to thrum with energy, carrying with it a sense of presence that was not human. He realized that the night's revelations were not confined to glass or microscope. The invisible life he had uncovered was embedded in the very environment, capable of influence and response beyond what he had imagined. He felt small, vulnerable, and yet exhilarated. He pored over his notes, trying to distill the chaos into understanding. Patterns emerged, subtle yet undeniable: movement, reaction, adaptation, persistence. These microorganisms, invisible to most, had agency, but not malice. They followed the principles of life itself, obeying forces he was only beginning to map. Pasteur's mind raced, connecting observations from the laboratory to wider phenomena: spoilage in wine, disease in animals, the unseen agents that shaped life and death. He felt the enormity of what he had uncovered. A crash echoed from the far shelf, a bottle toppling, spilling broth onto the cold stone floor. Pasteur jumped back, heart racing, but he noticed how the organisms responded, not randomly, but with precision. They avoided contamination, clustered strategically, and adapted instantly. He understood then the magnitude of his insight. Life was not merely reactive, it was resilient, intelligent in its own way, a force that demanded both respect and careful study. By the first light of dawn, the tension in the room had not lessened, yet a strange calm settled over Pasteur. He realized that fear was only part of the equation. The microorganisms had revealed a principle that was broader than him, broader than any single experiment. Life operated in realms invisible, governed by rules that required patience, observation, and rigor to uncover. Knowledge was not conquest, it was negotiation, dialogue, and humility before forces beyond direct control. He returned to the microscope one final time that morning. The creatures moved as they always had, but Pasteur now saw the patterns with clarity. Each movement, each adaptation, was part of a system, a network of interactions that extended far beyond the flask. The realization filled him with both awe and resolve. He understood that his mission was not simply to prove life existed in these forms, but to study, protect, and harness understanding to prevent suffering, spoilage, and disease in the larger world. A faint scraping noise from above reminded him that the world outside the microscope still existed, that unseen challenges awaited beyond the walls of his laboratory. Pasteur felt a surge of determination. He could not, and would not ignore what he had seen. The microorganisms had tested him, the shadows had haunted him, the unseen had challenged him. And yet, from that confrontation, he drew clarity. Life was governed by rules, invisible but knowable, and it was humanity's responsibility to uncover them, to act wisely upon that knowledge. He lifted the final notes of the night, hands steady, eyes bright. The darkness no longer felt threatening, only full of potential. The creatures in the flasks, the unseen agents in the air, the hidden world beneath every surface, they were part of a vast, intricate system, and he was now a witness, a chronicler, and a participant. The confrontation with the invisible had reached its first conclusion. Understanding required vigilance, patience, and courage, but it was attainable. Pasteur exhaled slowly, attention leaving him, replaced by a focused calm. The laboratory was still charged, alive with subtle motion, but he no longer felt helpless. He had faced the unseen, studied its movements, recognized its intelligence, and drawn a line between fear and knowledge. The path ahead would be long, perilous, filled with trials, but he now possessed a map, fragile, incomplete, yet real, of forces that shaped life, death, and the hidden world around him. He straightened, taking one last look at the flasks, at the swirling life forms, at the instruments that had borne witness to the night's revelations. The confrontation was over for now, but the work had only begun. Pasteur knew that what he had discovered would change everything. The world of the unseen was no longer an abstraction. It was a reality, one that demanded both respect and action. And as the first rays of sun crept across the laboratory floor, he understood that the night had not ended, it had only opened the door to the greatest discoveries of his life. A scream tore through the streets outside, distant yet impossibly sharp, as if the very air itself had broken under some invisible pressure. Louis Pasteur froze in the middle of his laboratory, the tremor in his hands betraying the intensity of his awareness. Something had changed. The world he had been peering into through glass and flame, the world of invisible life, was no longer contained. It pulsed beyond the flasks, beyond the microscopes, and he could feel its reach brushing against him. He approached the largest swan-necked flask, eyes wide, pulse hammering. The microorganisms inside had begun to behave differently. They were no longer mere observers of their environment, they seemed to move with intent, reacting almost as if they could sense the observer, reacting to him. Pasteur felt a chill run down his spine. He had studied these forms for months, charted their every motion, yet tonight, their activity suggested calculation. Purpose. Awareness. A sudden rattle from the window made him whip around. The latch had not moved in hours, yet the pane vibrated faintly, a resonance that seemed impossibly synchronized with the ripples in the liquid before him. He clenched his fists. Every sense screamed that he was at the edge of comprehension, that the world had shifted beneath him. What he had once thought to be simple life forms were something more, something he could neither define nor fully anticipate. Hours passed in silence punctuated by sudden, inexplicable sounds, the tap of tiny feet, the subtle shift of shadows, the faint hum of energy in the room. Pasteur's hand moved almost automatically, adjusting temperatures, transferring samples, annotating observations in furious detail. The tension was unbearable, every movement he made seemed to elicit a reaction. He realized that knowledge was no longer passive. The moment he observed, he influenced, and that influence was returned in ways he could not predict. He remembered the swan neck experiment that had first disproved spontaneous generation. Then he realized the irony, even that triumph now felt limited. The microorganisms had not emerged from nothing, yes, but they had developed, adapted, responded in ways that no man had yet anticipated. Pasteur understood that discovery was no longer about proving or disproving, but about dialogue, engagement, negotiation with a hidden intelligence that existed all around him, in flasks, in air, in shadows. A faint whisper seemed to slither along the walls. Pasteur's breath caught. The sound carried neither weight nor source, yet its presence was undeniable. It was as though the building itself had become sentient, an extension of the hidden world he had uncovered. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. Every step, every touch of a flask, every turn of a microscope lens was no longer just observation, it was participation. In the small hours, he introduced a sample of contaminated wine to a new culture. The response was instantaneous. The microorganisms divided with precision, avoided contamination, organized themselves into complex patterns that suggested adaptation beyond instinct. Pasteur felt a rush of exhilaration mixed with unease. He had glimpsed intelligence in its purest, smallest form, and it mirrored human curiosity in strange, disquieting ways. Suddenly, a crash echoed from the far table, sending instruments clattering to the floor. Pasteur spun. No one was there. And yet the microorganisms reacted, clustering, dispersing, organizing themselves into formations that seemed purposeful, almost communicative. The air in the laboratory felt thick with anticipation, heavy with the tension between revelation and danger. He realized the unseen world was not simply reacting, it was aware of him, his attention, his thoughts. He sank into a chair, eyes fixed on the microscope. Hours became a blur as he charted every movement, every pattern. A horrifying exhilaration gripped him. He was not alone in his discoveries. The life he had unveiled was intelligent, adaptive, responsive. And somewhere in that intelligence lay the potential for knowledge and for peril. He felt the full weight of his responsibility. The power to observe this hidden world was also the power to influence it, to shape outcomes he could not fully predict. The candle flickered and died. Pasteur remained still, attuned to the movement in the darkness, to the life that pulsed invisibly all around him. He no longer felt fear in the conventional sense, he felt the acute awareness of engagement. Knowledge had become a negotiation with a force far older, far more subtle, and far more pervasive than humanity had yet dared to understand. Morning light began to seep through the shutters, pale and hesitant. Pasteur exhaled slowly, yet the tension did not leave him. He had glimpsed a truth that transcended experiment. Life was governed by laws both seen and unseen, and mastery of knowledge required patience, vigilance, and humility. He knew the microorganisms would continue to act, to adapt, to test him, even when he was away. Their world was vast, hidden, persistent, and he was now irrevocably part of it. He lifted his notes, exhausted but alert. Patterns were emerging, faint but undeniable, observation influenced behavior, life responded to attention, unseen forces were as present as the tangible world. The realization hit him with clarity. The battle was not against nature, nor against the microorganisms themselves, it was for understanding, for insight, for the application of knowledge to protect, prevent, and guide. A scraping noise from above startled him, yet he no longer flinched. He had learned to measure the unseen, to anticipate its responses, to recognize its intelligence without being overwhelmed. The laboratory was alive, yes, but it was also a teacher, a proving ground. The confrontation had reached a conclusion. Knowledge required courage, engagement, and a willingness to confront forces invisible yet undeniable. Pasteur straightened, looking at the flasks, the slides, the instruments that had borne witness to the night's trials. The unseen world remained, pulsating with life, intelligent, responsive, inexhaustible. And he understood, finally, that the discoveries of this night would shape not only science, but humanity's relationship to the invisible forces that govern disease, decay, and life itself. The first rays of sun glimmered on the microscope's brass tube. Pasteur felt the tension ease, replaced with resolve. The unknown had been confronted, studied, understood in part, yet it remained vast. Knowledge had been wrested from shadows, but vigilance was eternal. He had crossed the threshold from curiosity to understanding, from observation to interaction, and emerged not unscathed, but enlightened. He knew the work ahead would demand every ounce of skill, patience, and courage he could muster. The unseen world was real. It was intelligent. It was everywhere. And he, Louis Pasteur, was its witness, its student, and its chronicler. The night had ended, but the lesson would last a lifetime. The smallest forces, invisible to most, held the power to transform the world, and only those who dared to confront them could hope to wield that understanding wisely. A whisper of movement brushed past him, sharp and deliberate, though the room was empty. Louis Pasteur froze, breath caught in his chest, eyes scanning the shadows that seemed alive, shifting with intent. He had felt the presence before, in flasks, in slides, in the very air, but tonight it pressed closer, demanding acknowledgement. The unseen world he had spent years studying was no longer confined to glass or microscope. It had expanded, insinuated itself into the room, into his thoughts, into the rhythm of his life. He could not turn away. Every instinct urged him to flee, yet he stayed rooted, knowing that retreat would mean losing the fragile thread of understanding he had been unraveling for months. The microorganisms he had once regarded as simple curiosities had become teachers, challengers, adversaries even. They moved with awareness, reacted to his presence, anticipated his intentions, and in that awareness was a lesson he could barely articulate. Knowledge was no longer a passive act, it was a negotiation with forces that existed beyond sight, beyond control. His hand trembled as he reached for the nearest flask. The liquid inside shimmered unnaturally, rippling as though it breathed. Pasteur's mind raced, recalling every observation, every experiment, every fleeting moment in which the invisible had revealed itself. He thought of the swan neck flasks, the wine spoilage, the silkworms he had saved, the diseases he had begun to understand. Each breakthrough had carried danger, yes, but also revelation. And now, he realized, the danger was no longer abstract. It was immediate, present, tangible in its unseen influence. A sudden sound, a soft scuff of something moving, came from the corner of the room. Pasteur whipped his head around. Nothing. Only the faint quiver of shadows along the wall. And yet, he knew it had been there. Presence. Intelligence. Awareness. He could no longer distinguish between what was natural and what was active, between observation and interaction. His experiments had taught him that life obeyed rules, but the rules had become more intricate, more subtle, more elusive than any text could capture. He returned to the microscope, hands shaking, eyes unblinking. The microorganisms moved in ways that mocked simplicity, darting, clustering, splitting, yet with a rhythm, a strategy that suggested comprehension. Pasteur realized he was witnessing adaptation in real time, intelligence at a scale so small that most humans could never perceive it. And in that perception, he found both exhilaration and terror. What was life if it could act, respond, and learn beyond observation? What responsibility did he carry as the one who had illuminated it? Hours passed unnoticed. Pasteur's notes grew denser, filled with sketches, calculations, observations of movement, and speculative annotations. Each entry was a testament to both his obsession and his growing understanding. The smallest forms of life could exert influence far beyond their size. The tension in the room was palpable, a constant pressure against the edges of his mind. He felt that at any moment, a single misstep could undo months of careful experimentation, or worse, summon consequences he could not control. The night deepened. Pasteur paused, resting his hands on the table, mind whirling. He thought of the broader implications: diseases, decay, infection, the unseen processes that had shaped the fate of humans for centuries. He realized that observation alone was insufficient. Knowledge without action was powerless. And yet, to act without understanding was reckless. He balanced on the knife edge of comprehension, aware that the smallest forces could determine outcomes larger than any single man's influence. A soft scraping sound returned, closer this time, almost deliberate. Pasteur's eyes met the darkened corner, and for a moment, he felt the brush of awareness against his own mind. The microorganisms in the flask seemed to pulse in unison with the sensation, reacting not to instruments, not to light, but to him. He shivered, recognizing a truth he could not ignore: the act of discovery was inseparable from engagement. Knowledge required presence, attention, and a willingness to confront forces beyond comprehension. He leaned back in his chair, trying to draw together his thoughts. The path of science, of curiosity, of relentless inquiry, had led him here, not merely to observations, but to confrontation. Pasteur understood that life was more than a passive phenomenon. It was adaptive, intelligent, resilient, and omnipresent. And in that realization, he felt a mixture of awe and responsibility that pressed against his chest with suffocating weight. Hours turned into the first gray light of dawn. Pasteur looked around the laboratory, flasks, slides, instruments, and shadows all alive with subtle movement. He recognized a pattern emerging, not in the organisms alone, but in the interaction between observer and observed. Understanding was not ownership, it was dialogue, respect, negotiation with forces far older and far subtler than any human construct. And in this awareness, Pasteur felt a quiet resolve. The tension had not vanished, it had transformed into vigilance, into clarity of purpose. He realized that he was no longer studying microorganisms as objects. He was studying life itself, in its most fundamental, invisible form, in dialogue with forces that had shaped existence long before him and would continue long after. His thoughts drifted to the diseases that plagued humans and animals, the spoilage that ruined crops and wine, the countless unseen agents that shaped history in silence. He understood that mastery of knowledge demanded not just intellect, but patience, courage, and humility before the hidden patterns of life. A faint movement near the door pulled him from reflection. He rose slowly, steadying his hands. Whatever awaited, he would meet it with comprehension, with curiosity, and with resolve. The room seemed alive, yet he felt connected to it in a new way: participant, observer, chronicler, and guardian. Knowledge had become responsibility, understanding inseparable from engagement. The unseen world was no longer a mystery to fear, it was a realm to learn from, to respect, to navigate with care. Pasteur returned to the microscope, leaning close to observe one final movement before the morning fully broke. He marveled at the precision, the persistence, the subtle intelligence of life so small that it defied ordinary perception. And in that quiet, charged moment, he understood that discovery was never the end, it was a commitment. To know life was to confront it, to challenge it, to learn from it, and to apply that understanding to protect and guide. The first rays of sun illuminated the laboratory, but Pasteur's eyes remained fixed on the invisible, the intelligent, the unseen forces that had tested him through endless nights. He felt the tension persist, but it was tempered by purpose. The world of hidden life had revealed itself to him, and he had risen to the challenge, not merely to observe, but to comprehend, to act, and to carry that understanding into the wider world. Knowledge had become action, observation had become engagement, and the unseen had become a teacher, demanding both courage and wisdom. Louis Pasteur leaned back, heart steadying, mind alert, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He had crossed thresholds few dared approach. He had faced forces invisible yet undeniable. And he understood, with a clarity born of relentless pursuit and unyielding curiosity, that the journey had only just begun. The invisible world pulsed around him, intelligent and patient, and he would meet it with insight, vigilance, and awe, for the rest of his life.